Today we're going to continue with the bespoke jacket. Here I'm going to do the pockets, the welt pockets, or the welt pocket and the double jet pocket with the flap. So I've got my fabric for the flaps, my fabric for a facing. You don't really need a facing if you've got a flap, but I'm extra, I do that. Then I've got the lining that's going to go behind the flaps. For the welt, I've got a piece of fabric, I've got two pieces of pocketing, and here I've got what I'm going to use to make the two jets, and here I've fused that. And then I don't fuse directly onto the fabric because I'm very extra, so I've got this piece of the lap hair that I've fused the back of it so that the back is going to touch, or that fusing is going to touch the fabric. And this is very soft. It's going to give you a nice soft flap. They're still going to be stiff and structured. And then the same for the welt. I've got just the exact shape of my welt cut out, and that's going to sit right there in my shape. So I'm going to do all of that. First, what I need to do is just quickly iron that front portion of the jacket that I was working on. You'll also see I'm not very exact with my measurements here. I just kind of cut it out large enough. Obviously this is exact. This is exactly 15 centimeters, which is how I want my pocket to be. Here I make it 6. And this is 10 by 2.5 with the angle. Those are exact because that's the exact form. But these things are not exact because I'm just going to trim them down as I go. So here how I do, I mark 3.5 centimeters from the top edge. And now we want it to be 15 centimeters. I'm just going to get the middle, and that's what, 7.5 each side. 7.5, and there's 15. And I just make sure that that is exactly straight. And then I'll join this onto the jacket when I get there. 3.5. And 15. So here I'm just going to do the double jets and the welt one time. I'll see if I have time to do a separate video on welt and jet pockets, but for now it's just welt and jets together. Alright, so that's marked. These we're going to join I'm just checking here because these have moved around a little bit. Oh, that's actually the wrong side. That's the right side. Yeah. So here I'm going to base that onto there. And I'm going to do this in the same way that I did the collar that I was working on the other day. How am I doing a new one of these? Which is just to base around the edges. It's a little bit different this one because this chap really dislikes prick stitching, which I can't even really wrap my head around how someone can be so crazy as to dislike prick stitching. But usually I'll use the prick stitch around the edge of the pocket flap to secure this horsehair in place, but now I cannot do that. So I'm going to have to come up with a little bit of a different strategy there. I'll just show you that as I go. So here we are, just securing the back of the pocket. Nothing too exciting. As you know, I do this because I'm just paranoid about diffusing directly on the fabric. Even though here it's a pocket, so there I really don't think it will be such a drama. But yeah, I'm so tired of being sabotaged by the fusing, being disappointed by those bubbles that appear. Okay, So flip it over this side, and I'm just going to feel the edge with my fingers here. And I don't want this to be tight, but I definitely do not want it to be loose. So I'm just going to kind of smooth it out with my fingers there. As much as I can, working on the flat. And there we are. So obviously the other flap will be the same. Here for the welt pocket, let me just check this measurement because I see it's not really fitting inside my little shape. You know, it's 10 and a half for some random reason. Let me just skinny that down. So this should be 10. 10. Is that going to fit in there? Yes. Okay, so see here, I'm half a centimeter from the edge of the fabric. And I've cut this, I think 10 centimeters, 8 centimeters. 8 centimeters wide, I've just left 3 on the sides. Again, this is just because I don't really have an exact pattern. But I really should for this one because really all of my well pockets on the chest are 10 centimeters. So, but yeah, anyway, like I kind of just cut it like the Italians. I just cut it this big, and then as I go, I work down. We did actually make a pattern for this, and it like once I made it, I just put it in a file, and it's where I left it. But now that the business is expanding and my team is really taking over some work for me, it's so fantastic. I'm having more time to really focus my brain a little bit. And these videos are one example of that. I actually have this time finally to really take the time to look at my systems and see where I can improve them. Up until now, it's really just been very like just kind of survival mode. Okay, so I'm going to give that an iron. Obviously, I'm going to base that iron on iron. This will be pinning in a moment. Of course, here once I've ironed it, I'll then take it with the lining, right sides together, and stitch it in the same way that I do the collar. I'm gonna secure this edge and just give it a bit of a curve there, just so that it really pulls the lining towards the back. So I'm gonna go do all of that, and then we'll catch up in a moment. Given my 4-part, one more iron. Now let's come off the mannequin, and what I'm gonna do is get this pocket drawn in exactly where I want it. Once I find my chalk, which must be here somewhere, or the chalk that is underneath the thing I'm working on. Okay, so obviously this cut is the center of my pocket. So I'm just going to go along that cut. Now my pocket is 15 centimeters in total. This is based on the hand width of my client. And I try to more or less balance the pocket between the dart and the seam. So here I've got 1.5 centimeters in front, and here it's just over, maybe like 1.75, 2 centimeters behind this seam here. Obviously, I don't want to go too much further in front of the dart. So if the pocket's going to be wider, if it's going to be this chap has a very broad hand, then I'll rather shift this dart a little bit forward just to, like balance that pocket quite nicely. I don't know if that's even a thing, but that's how I do it. And then these flaps, I'm going to now match this very broad H that I drew between the layers. I'm going to stitch on either side of this line. Let me just see what's happening here. 3/4 cent. On each side of that line, I'm going to stitch 1/2 centimeter. That, for me corresponds to half a machine foot because I'm working on the industrial machines. So obviously you must do whatever math is going to work for you. I like to have the total of my pocket 1 centimeter, so it's 1/2 centimeter on each side of the line. Of course, you can do whatever measurements are going to work for you. With your 1/2 centimeter on each side of this line, back check, back check, back check, back check. So I'll do the same on the other side. And you'll see here what I did with the welt. Depending on how I'm feeling that day, sometimes I'll start the lining at the back here and move it down. For this one, I'm just going to do more of a simple one. I'm just folding this over, and then I'm going to stitch, but not come past the edge of where I put my fuse in. Now, if you don't want to be extra and do this horsehair situation, you can just fuse directly. And in that case, I would fuse this 1/2 centimeter extra so that the fusing is now going to be 3 centimeters, even though your shape is 2.5 centimeters. It's just this one with the horsehair that you can't really do that. So what I'm going to do is just stitch. I'm going to stop at the corner there of my horsehair and up to the top. Same both sides. All right, so let me pop to the sewing machine. Okay, so I stitch that. Then what you do is you cut through just this jet layer and check that where you have your slash for the pocket is actually in the middle. You haven't done anything crazy there. Then you iron these two lips up like that. Now before I continue, I'm going to pop to the sewing machine and just do kind of like a tack over this seam here. Reason being, we're now going to cut here, and same story as here. If we cut it right there and there's no back tack, it's going to start unraveling. So though it is secured by the stitch of this jet, I'm always paranoid it's going to start unraveling here. When I remember, I actually stitched this seam twice, just around here where the pocket is. I hardly ever remember. But then I also come back here and just do like stitch that closed. And then from there, we'll be cutting in our miter, cutting to the corner, and then down the center, to the corner, to the corner. I'll be doing that in a second. So now these ones, usually I would just trim this down, flip it over, and do the prick stitching around the edge to give it a nice, beautiful prick stitch. But sometimes your clients are just insane and they dislike prick stitching. So for this one, what I'm going to do is a little bit more like how I will secure the horsehair to the garment on the front edges. Let's see what's going to be the easiest. So here, I'm going to stitch from the horsehair using a herringbone stitch to the fabric on the outside of the seam. So there, I'm just doing 3 spots in one. Move this out the way. And then just coming just to the side of my stitch line. And you also see how I stitch this. See, there's a little bit of a bubble there. And that's just going to allow it to curve nice and neatly and not let it kind of flap out like that, showing the lining. Now, usually also having the prick stitch assists with that, but sometimes you just have to deal with the insanity of insane clients. So what I'm doing is I'm just going to herringbone this all the way around, And then I'm going to put a thin piece of fusing around there. And that is going to keep this in place for me. So I'm just going to continue this. And with welt, I'm going to do the same, just on the edges there. I can't really do the top because that is just a fold. There's no seam there. Could have put a seam there, but I don't like putting a seam there. I like it just to be a fold. The reason I didn't put the lining at the back of this one, I'm a bit pressed for time. So yeah, I'm just not doing it. And the other reason is that this fabric is quite fine, very, very thin fabric. So I'm not too fussed about it being too bulky with, the you're going to have 2 layers of fabric and then the 2 layers of seam allowance. So it's 4 layers of fabric. So you must consider the thickness of the fabric when you're doing that. If it was a bit of a thicker fabric, I would have rather put a lining at the back of the welt just so that it can lie nice and flat on the chest. But because it's so thin, I'm not going to do that. So yeah, I'm just going to continue with this. And then I'll do my my little tack in a way there on the jacket front where I am putting the pocket in. And I'll put my fusing here. So on the pocket and the flap side, I actually decided also to stitch here at the bottom of this welt and put this very, very, very thin fusing over because I need to be able to see the edge of this horsehair because I'm going to stitch right on that line. So as you see, I've done that. I just put the herringbone stitched around there, and I'm going to cut on this side because here I can still see the stitching, whereas on the other side it's a little bit obscured by the fusing. A little bit closer around the corners, but not too close. Just going to pop that around. I don't know if I want to baste this or if I'm brave enough to just iron it. I think I can just iron this. Usually, like I say, I'd prick stitch that. I feel confident to just iron that back. And with the fusing and all of that, it's going to hold this nicely. And I'm just going to make sure that I really pull my lining back so it doesn't end up poking out like that, which usually would be the job of the prick stitching. But anyway, let me stop complaining about that and just focus on making fashion. So, okay, that one obviously same story. Here in the welt, just cutting off these corners. Now I'm going to cut the wedge right into that stitch. But I'm going to cut the wedge from the top like this so that at the bottom the wedge is actually straight. And at the top it has the edge. The reason I do that is because if I cut a regular wedge, here, I would be really cutting off this little piece of the seam allowance. And I do actually want that. It's just going to give me more control of where I'm stitching. I might trim it out later, but for now I don't want to wreck that. So because this is quite fine, I'm just going to layer this a little bit by just cutting off that little piece. So that one. Okay. Let's bring this inside out. Being illegal by pushing it from the inside. I have a knitting needle here somewhere. There it is. But whatever, I'll just use my pair of scissors here. Give me a nice sharp edge. And there we go. Now I was wondering if I should do some kind of stitch at the back here, just to grab it onto the horsehair. Yeah, I think I'm going to do that. I'll see if I can. If it's actually feasible. So I don't, there's no way this can really collapse. That horsehair, the horsehair is vertical like that. There's no way it can really collapse, to be honest. So now I'm just going to iron that, I'll iron this. And now let's look at the jets. Let's get this pen out the way. All right, so once I've stitched that, I did my little back tack there. Then I cut along this pocket slash there, mitered into the corner. Then here, these two triangles, iron that out the way. This one you can see I cut away that part of the um, this cotton that I put on the canvas. I just cut that away just to make that a little bit smoother. Iron that triangle in, and then flipped it this way and iron that seam allowance open. See there? Iron that seam allowance open. Then I'm going to baste this. So from the right side, I'm going to make sure my seam allowance are open. One going up, one going down. And I'm going to just feel, obviously one seam allowance is right here in the center. So I'm just going to feel where that is. And fold this directly on that. Now, the real high-end method is to actually stitch this by hand and stitch in the ditch there. Obviously not with a green thread, but with a navy blue. And that will then finish off the pocket. You'll finish off these welts by hand. I'm not such a fan of that. I feel that hand stitching is not as strong as machine stitching. So I would rather stitch it by machine. So what's happening here is that the fabric itself wants to kind of just get bigger on one side. So I'm just making sure I've got all of this straight. Which can be a bit of a fiddle. I'm just going to pin that down. So there's really nothing to it. You just got to fold that out over, and then baste as you go. So I think it's this fusing that's quite rough. So I'm struggling to slide the welts neatly into place. Yeah, so that's that. I'm just going to baste these welts. I think it is this fusing that's really not wanting me to have an easy job of this. There we go. Basting, basting, basting. And then after this, give it a very, very light iron. And then I'll hit the sewing machine. Okay, so here we are at the one end. And what I'm going to do is just finish off in the corner. I don't want to be exactly in the corner because I want to stitch there. Finish in the corner 3 times in one spot. There is one jet of my double jets done. Let's come to the next one. So let's try and fold this a bit more methodically. So it will stop giving me drama. Okay. Now, if you don't want to use a fusing there, then you will put a piece of silicea behind your fabric as the fusing and then just treat as one. I would definitely put fusing just on the jacket side or the garment side. I would definitely fuse that portion that you're going to cut through the pocket. I wouldn't neglect your fusing there. But I feel, on these jets, to fuse is not a crime. And as you know, I fuse with a press, a heat press, and then I just leave it for 12 hours so that it really cools down and those two layers really melt into each other. For something small like this that's also so encased by seams, I feel is feasible. But of course, I discuss this with the clients. I do have an option of really using absolute minimal fusing, but it's more expensive because that's more time for me. Right, so give that just a bit of a minimal iron and then quickly hit the sewing machine. And how am I going to sew this? What we're going to do is look here, see where that triangle is. Now these two, because it was one piece, they should match up there on the edge. I don't want to sew them mismatching like that because then on the front side it's going to be a disaster. So here I want to make sure those two match. And I want to start by sewing over the triangle. And here I'm going to sew a little bit like just to kind of lock those two portions in place. Then I'll come around here, follow that line. I'll do the same here, lock those two and the triangle, making sure that those two are straight. Come around again. And then I like to go around one more time. The first time I stitch right here on the original stitch line. Second time I just stitch a little bit lower just to kind of catch this flap so it doesn't flap out too much. But first I'll iron that and iron these pocket flaps and stuff, and then we'll hit the sewing machine with that. All right, there we've got it nicely ironed. Last thing we're going to do, I'm just going to stitch that by machine to secure that piece of the lining, and I am just going to just curve this up just to make sure that this lining doesn't flip out, poke out over the edges. So this welt, I'm going to stitch here onto the suit. See, here's where my pocket's going to be. So I want to be, I don't know, 2 centimeters, 2.5 centimeters around the edges. I'm just going to do a basting stitch all the way around. Because I don't want to go through the very thick layers of horsehair that I've put there. So I'm going to trim that down. And I want this basting stitch just to continue to hold it in place. So of course you can, is this not that sabotaging as much? You can obviously, like I was saying, you can put the pockets on first before you do the horsehair. But I find that it becomes a bit lumpy. And I like this method because it also uses the pocket to join the horsehair to the fabric, so it just secures it a little bit more. All right, good enough. So here at the back, I now just have to see where is that basting I just did, which is right here. See, there it goes. Could have done this in another color if I really wanted to. See, there it is. And it's not there somewhere. Okay. Now I'm going to take a very sharp scissor and cut just the domains. Need something sharper than this. So here I'm cutting maybe a centimeter in that line. No real rules here. Here I can't really cut the domains separate because it's all stitched together. Okay, there we are. There we are. And then next, I'm going to cut just this horsehair. For this one, I just want to get and again maybe about a centimeter up and just the horsehair. There we go. Okay. Then I just want to check here on my corners. Do I get through to just the canvas? You see, I'm here still a little bit on the horsehair, so I'm just going to cut that out a little bit, that out a little bit, and maybe, yeah, that'll be fine. So just want to cut those corners down. At the top corners, I don't mind so much because that's still going to give me some security to stitch onto. But here at the corner, especially if I've got all those layers turning, I can't have too much thickness. Just check it again. Perfect. Perfect. So what I'm going to do here is just cut off a little bit more of this domain, just so I've got a bit of a better layer there. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Then I'll go, I suppose you can use any color, but I'm just going to use a black just for in case. Then I'm just going to, in a way, re-stitch that. I enjoy herringbone just because I really like herringbone stitching. I'm going to keep my left hand under here to make sure I don't stitch through the garment. It would be very unfashionable if I were to do something crazy like that. So, of course, no knots. I'm just going to stitch 3 times in one place. and then you catch the canvas, catch the horsehair, and I'm just going to keep going around like this. And then I'll do the same, of course, with the domette. Just stitch it from the domette onto the horsehair. Because here the stitching gets a little bit crazy, so you're always going to have fun knots happening. And of course, if you want to eliminate that, you can just put the wax. So here, as I mentioned, we're then going to go horsehair to domette. And that's that. I'm just going to carry on doing that. And then what I'll do is I'll flip around. Okay, so from there, I'm going to now join in my chest pocket. And I'm going to stitch it along this line that's right next door to my fusing. Unfortunately, this is not a match, it's not a pattern, because that can get a little bit more complex. So in that case, if it was a pattern, I would just pin that and flip it up and make sure that my pattern is actually matching. But this is looking totally fine. Am I dead center there? Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to stitch that. It's a little bit fiddly. You have to kind of shift this around. Start in there, stitch across, shift it around. But it's doable. Stitch that, stitch this, stitch these, and then more fashion. Right, so there you can see, just stitched it a bit together there, around twice, together there. There is my double jet. Fashion baby. So these pocket flaps, just going to place in there. I actually want this one on this side, because the corner here, it's not the greatest curve you ever saw in your life, so I'd rather have that facing backwards. And here I usually have 5 centimeters, maybe 4 centimeters, 4.5. I kind of judge it as I go. This guy, for his height, will rather do 4.5. Just going to put that in place. Make double sure I have that 4.5. And what I do with these is here at the back, I catch it and just making sure this is all into the seam allowance. I'm just going to flip it this way, like so, and I'll just do a zigzag over there just to catch this in place. Then one time I'm going to go with my pocket bag. Now these ones, just with the shape of the pocket bag that I had, I'm just going to cut it in one, and then I'll do that measurement and flip it up. So I'm just going to stitch that. Obviously, same on the other pocket. This welt, I'm now going to put the lining. This one always confuses me just a little bit. Let's see. So your top side should be out this way. Here it is. So I'm going to put it on there. And you see I cut this way, way, way larger than I need to. It's just how I roll. It's actually that way, sorry. So the larger side here at the top, up that way. And here, I just want to make sure. So here I let my edges touch there. I'm going to stitch this at with 1 foot seam allowance. So that again, it's a half centimeter. And then I'm just going to make sure that I'm quite a bit back from that stitch line. Just going to mark that, stitch that out, and then we'll carry on with the pockets. So there we have it. Just did a zigzag over there. I like the zigzag because it's kind of more flat. It isn't going to allow this to flap over so easily. And I stitch this pocket bag, iron that down. I'm going to understitch this because I want this pocket to be very secure. Now here I need to make sure that I've got at least 10 centimeters clear because obviously I've got a 5 centimeter turn up there and I don't want this to interact there. Usually I make this 10 to 15 centimeters deep, kind of depending how the maths works out. 15 centimeters, that's going to be fine. So I can then flatten it out and um, just stitch that a little bit, pin that a little bit. I'm going to flip this over and just cut that so that I know where I'm stitching this to later on. And now having done that, I'm going to put my facing on. Now a facing you don't really need because you don't really get under there to see that, and even if your flap is on the inside, okay, it's pinned there now, you're not going to see anything. But I like to put a facing, just makes me feel fabulous. So you'll see my facings, I just iron them up on one side. And that's because, as I've described before, I don't like to put a overlock there because it ends up being very catchy. Those threads like to catch on keys, and it's really keys, like those are the main culprit, the key ring. Oh, so catchy. And that's just not an experience that I enjoy giving to my clients. So I'm just going to fold that up. Obviously, I'll just stitch that all the way around. This will only give a single stitch. And then here, I'm going to understitch that. My welt pocket up here, you see I stitched the pocket bag down, and I've ironed it now, and I continued that iron flat so that this portion is also straight. It's just going to help me when I tuck this in. And from there, there's nothing to it. I'm just going to make sure my seam allowances are out of the way. I'm going to just cut between these two lines through all the layers. Now here, for this miter, I'm going to stop about 1.5 centimeters behind the shorter line and then cut to that stitch point like usual. Now this one, I don't really want to cut from here straight. You see, that gives me a very, very narrow seam allowance there, and this tends to unravel. So I'm going to cut in a bit of a bow. So I'm just going to move that seam allowance out of the way. And you see, I'm just going to cut maybe straight a little bit and then curve down into that point. Now here, this bit of the horsehair, I'm going to cut out. This bit of the horsehair I'm going to leave just like that. I'm not going to trim that down because if I trim it down, it's going to end up wiggling loose of my stitching, and the stitching is actually holding it in place. I don't really want that flapping about, so I'd rather just leave it in like that. Okay, so now we're going to mite into that corner, and then do a nice bow into that corner, and then we're going to cut out that part of the crosshair. All right, so number one, I'm going to iron those two triangles like that. And now you see I'm going to pull this through, and because it's ironed straight on those edges, it's going to be easy to be straight at the back here. And then from this side, I'm going to now fold that corner in. And here I'm just going to hand stitch. I'm just going to whip that. And here I'll just do a prick stitch in a hidden location so the chap will never know. Obviously you can do this by machine. I just find it very fiddly to do. And this portion of the welt, I'm going to iron up this portion of the pocket. So I'm going to leave the, there we go. Going to leave the jacket still down. Going to iron that portion up, and then come this side, iron it flat. So let me do all of that. So here you can see I've just done an understitch there. Here I ended up just stitching top and bottom because it was just easier with the machine. Now I can flip that up and join all of this. And of course I'm going to do this twice because here we do not want a hole opening up in our pockets. So I'm just putting that in place. And I'll stitch that around. So here I'm just going to put one or two pins here so I know exactly where this corner is because I am going to stitch here. And I'm also just going to stitch the corners around because a corner is where you have most of your tension. So around one is less likely to come undone. So obviously I'm just going to go ahead and stitch that. Now here you can see I just whip stitch the edges there, did a bit of a prick stitch, whip stitch, and then this portion of the welt seam allowance ironed up, lift that around, and then in there, iron the seam allowances open. I'm going to cover it with that. Now here I cut off the little corner of my half a centimeter that I had, just so that it can neatly squeeze in there. I'm just going to pin it like this to hold those seam allowances exactly how I want them. And do that on the corners and the center. Okay. I want to make sure that this is not unduly tight anywhere or unduly loose anywhere. Usually over the top of this I have a prick stitch, just over the top here, but you know the story. Okay, can't use black. So this I am going to stitch by hand. This I don't really think you can do by machine. It's going to have a single thread, so it can be nice and tiny. going to come up in this corner, and I'm going to be in the ditch. So right in that seam, I'm going to be stitching, and I do need to do just a very small back stitch because if you're a running stitch, you run the risk of actually just stitching in between the stitches, which is not really going to help anyone. Just a little bit back and forwards, being in that ditch. There we go. That is the story. Nothing too exciting. Just moving along. The whole time making sure that my seam is flipped open at the back. Alright, and here we are right at the end. Nothing too exciting. I'm just going to knot that off. Okay. Making sure that my knot is nice and tiny. Just going to grab a portion. Take this around twice. There we go. Okay. So there, that's done. I'm going to give that an iron. And then what I'll do is I'll put this portion of the pocket bag, I'll just stitch it there right sides together. You actually do that now, and then I'll just iron it one time. So just stitching this onto the other edge. Now obviously, had I attached the lining to the back of the welt, it would be much further down like this, much longer. And then I would just not be doing anything right now. I would just be joining this part of the pocket to that. But because I did this one like this, I'm joining the pocket there first and joining that pocket. So there we have it. There's the pocket bag done. Of course, I'm just going to trim down over here. You see, I did the edges or the corners in the round to just give it some strength and stability. And here I'm just going to layer this down so that we don't have 17 ends right on one spot. Trim out that corner. Then the last thing I'm going to do here is do a herringbone stitch, joining this. I think this is my navy blue, so I'm just going to save this for the welt. I'm going to do a double. I'm going to do a herringbone stitch and just join this here to the seam allowance, and then of course over the horsehair to the horsehair. This is just going to help it to stay upright and not collapse. So nothing too exciting about that, just a bit of a stabilizer. I'm going to knot off there, and you see here it's come through this very soft cotton portion, and it hasn't caused me any drama turning that around. Now, obviously I'll continue that. Here for the welt, here we've got the pieces through. I'm not going to understitch this because we don't really need all of that strength up here. No one even really uses this pocket. Here I usually do 10 centimeters. I'm just going to draw that in. And I'm just gonna kind of with my eyes round that out. And I just put that together. And I'm just gonna trim the edges of this. I'm gonna flip it this way and just stitch around there. And you see here, I'm just gonna get as close into that edge as I can. Stitch around close into that edge, keeping all the layers as flat as possible, not introducing any extra bulk. And then on this side, I'll pull this basting out so that it's out of my way. And then I'm just going to do a bar tack just on the edge here. Bar tack, bar tack. Usually I would also do a D-stitch around the edge of the pocket, but given this client's dislike of prick stitching, I'm going to also neglect that. So yeah, here I just want the basting out of the way so it doesn't get caught in that in the bar tack, and then cause me all of that extra stress to have to try and unpick this from the bar tack. So that's that. Here we pop over to the machine. Here we are, basically done. So I've put the bar tack here, front and back, and that just goes through all the layers just to give it some nice security. I finished stitching the pocket bag here. And then this, I always pin over a form so that I have that around. I don't want to pin it on the flat. And then when it goes around, it ends up being too tight. This, you can stitch by machine, just giving a very neat, narrow zigzag there on the edges. But of course, because I love hand stitching, I'll be stitching that by hand. So there's really nothing to it. I'm just going to climb in the back here, grab it here in the corner. Now all of this extra fray, I'm going to end up tucking in as I go. Now this one, it's the same fabric front and back, but usually, or if it's a thicker fabric, I'll have the lining at the back. And so when we stitch this, we actually want to skip the lining and just stitch the front portion. This is such a fine fabric. It's really very tough to, just get that stitch nice and neat. And I'm just going to carry that on. Just stitching it neat as possible. All the way up this edge. Nothing too exciting about that. One thing I do here, I'm just gonna get that out of the way for a second. So of course making sure I don't over pull my thread so that it becomes too tight. Coming up here to the edge, and one thing that I like to do is just stitch maybe 2 stitches over the top. Just makes it nice and secure. And then I come back. Now these pockets are hardly ever used, but I still want them to be nice and secure. Just going to try as much as I can to be in the middle of the last stitches that I did. And I'll do that on the other side. And that will be that. We'll then have our welt pockets and our double jets with a flap, and the forepart will be done. From here I'll be doing the padding stitch on the lapel, turn that backwards, and then finishing off this front section, and then putting on the facing. So that is that. Make it fashion.